So this presentation entitled "Developing a Military Economic Policy Model," and it's going to use student game design as a teaching methodology. So let's take that apart. Developing a military economic policy model. So it's going to be a model, and what we're going to try to do is take our assumptions about how the world works and how the Chief of Staff of the Army might make economic policy decisions for the development of the Army budget so that the Army, after we acquire the right equipment and people and train them and make them ready and station them at the right locations, that we have an Army that has the right capabilities that are needed to implement and support the national security strategy, whatever it may happen to be at that time. And now the challenge of this is that it takes a long time to make economic changes and changes to the composition of an army, which is a large profession and a large organization. You can't make those changes instantaneously. And so the Chief of Staff of the Army, who has that responsibility, has to develop forecasting techniques in order to estimate what the future will hold, and then develop plans and then manage those plans to acquire the right capabilities so that they'll be ready for use based on what the nation needs. He is constrained by complicated systems for planning and programming and resource management and budgeting that come from both the Department of Defense and from Congress and from the President. So there's a considerable lag between the decisions that he makes and the final implementation and realization of those plans in the world. And that lag time is why the forecasting and then the monitoring of the world is so important. So he has to forecast what the world will be like and set things in motion to create the capabilities based on that forecast, and then monitor the state of the world around him so that if the underlying circumstances and variables of the world are changing, then he can make changes in his plans so that he doesn't stay on the current track too long. Once he commits to a strategy, if he discovers the world is changing in other directions, then he needs to adjust his strategy so that he doesn't send good money after bad. He can't do anything about when that change is going to occur, but what he has to do is be able to monitor, sense, and respond to those changes so that he can get the best fit between the actual army that he has developed and what the needs of the moment are. So the model then is going to somehow try to make an explicit model for how that might be done so that we can study the model to see if there are ways in which we might improve our thinking once we present that model to other subject matter experts and stakeholders. We can then use the model to set the agenda to discover how we all think about making these kinds of decisions and make an effort to improve that process. So this is going to be about applied research, and the applied research will be in the activity or the action of developing a model. Hand in hand with this, we're going to see if we can turn this particular model into a game designed by the students who will then play that game, to see if the act of designing the game can actually be an effective way of teaching the underlying principles of this way of thinking, of doing applied strategic thinking, better than perhaps traditional forms of lecture and other forms of discovery learning. So we're going to explicitly look at student game design then as a teaching methodology or a piece of pedagogy. So we'll tie that back to the application of this master's level research. So with that in mind, what we've crafted as a primary research question is this: can we model the Chief of Staff of the Army's management challenge, which is anticipating the future national strategic postures? And by that we mean, can he get advance warning of what that national strategic requirement for the Army is going to be? Or does he have to wait for that to change before he can act? So can he anticipate what that future national strategic posture might be, so that today he can make budget decisions that will efficiently and effectively shape an appropriate and timely military strategy? So let's take that apart. If he can estimate with some degree of confidence what that future strategic posture might be, he can then make the budget decisions today to be both efficient and effective. So efficiently means that he can minimize the dollars that are being spent on things that will no longer be needed in the future. So how soon can he determine when a program no longer is going to be needed? Or how soon can he determine when a new capability should be funded, so that we can be very efficient about how we then curtail or develop that program? And then can he effectively shape that strategy? Meaning that are the choices that he makes to fund one program over another, or to cancel this one rather than that one, can he be effective in getting that right ahead of time, so that we not only save money, but we can then create those capabilities in a cost-effective way? So we're looking at a decision system that must be both efficient and effective. And so the appropriate and timely criteria then, appropriate means that he's matched the set of capabilities chosen against what the requirements of implementing that strategy might be. And then timely, how closely can he get a good match to when the requirement is generated? So that's what we're looking at as the primary research question. Can we build the model that allows us to make these kinds of decisions more effectively? So this is the current state of our thinking, and let me walk you through how we got there and then what we think this model might look like. I'll conclude with some remarks on how I see this being used as a pedagogical device, in addition to how this will be treated as master's level research. So we began with this notion that there are some number of potential future states of nature. We're going to call those A, B, C, and D for now. And that these states of nature correspond to a particular scenario. And in each scenario, the nation is going to adopt a particular international posture with respect to the rest of the world. The role of the nation inside the world community as a member of the world community. And that's driven by the negotiations between Congress and the President, between the executive and the legislative branches. And in that negotiation, that political exchange, decisions are made concerning a vision for how America should be in the future. And that culminates in the publication of strategic documents. The National Security Strategy, written by the President, and then instructions from Congress to the services and Department of Defense and the President that describe what they have agreed to appropriate and to authorize for the conduct of military operations under Title X, the law. So there's a complex political negotiation that goes into identifying the scenario that's in play. And so, for purposes of this model, we wanted to begin with a number of these that could be clearly distinguished and which would allow for the development of uh, detailed, appropriate military responses. So, let's describe the states of nature. We described the state of nature A as one in which the United States stood preeminent in the world as the global hegemon, the superpower with no peer competitors. And what we say is that if that were the posture that were agreed upon between Congress and the President as our appropriate role in the world, that there would be a set of national military strategies and capabilities that must be present in order to be able to support the national objectives and goals of being that global hegemon. The easiest couple of examples to see would be that we would need to be able to invest in roll-on, roll-off ships, rapidly deployable, fast sea lift ships that could carry the heavy combat forces of an army to any spot in the world in order to project force. The logic is that we need force deployable heavy forces that can achieve dominance in conventional operations. And so to get them there quickly, you need fast roll-on, roll-off ships and other forms of strategic mobility that allow us to project force to anywhere in the world. We might also need a set of quickly deployable forces for initial advantages, and then deployable heavy forces to provide the decisive force. So those are the kinds of capabilities that you would need to have as a global hegemon. You might also say we need to invest in overseas garrisons with families to demonstrate our commitment to military operations and military dominance in all of the regions of the world, and that would represent a significant dollar cost to be able to create, station, and support these forward deployed forces. The Cold War is a good example of the kinds of costs that are associated with that. And then during times of economic crisis, we've seen that it's difficult to find political support for spending of that type, and so in an effort to save and reduce budgets, that kind of forward presence and the purchase of strategic platforms, deployability platforms, was reduced. And so that's the logic chain that connects what we think of as required or necessary military capabilities that could support the posture of global hegemon. I'm going to drop down to the bottom one, posture D, one in which our preeminent policy choice is to focus exclusively on homeland defense. America is an isolationist nation, concerned only with border security and internal defense, and not looking to project power outside of the international boundaries and borders. And so an appropriate national military strategy here would be one that did not require that kind of strategic mobility that's needed for A, but is simply investing in technologies and forces that allow us to preserve border integrity, to prevent incursions that could provide economic independence, if you will, military independence of the homeland. And so we could conceive of a world in which that was the policy choice for strategic posture, based on the concurrence of Congress and the President. And so that would call for quite a different set of military capabilities and forces in order to develop an appropriate national military strategy, or NMS. So you can see how at the extremes of this array, we have considerably different military capabilities that are appropriate in order to support the national strategy. So if that's A and D, we described B then as a step down from the global hegemon, and the U.S. would take on a role of competing superpower, being one among a few equals. We might think of the Russia, China, Euro, and the U.S. And even Japan thrown there. Maybe it's the global seven, the group of seven, the G7s. So, by whatever means you might want to measure superpower status, we might say these preeminent nations in the world are engaged in jockeying for position and influence, soft and hard power, direct and indirect influence. And so the appropriate national military strategy for that to be developed would be the focus of the spending efforts of the budget, if we thought that was going to be the likely posture. Posture C we described as one where the United States rolled back to something like the Monroe Doctrine boundaries and became the preeminent regional power in the Western Hemisphere or in the Northern American hemisphere, in the NAFTA trade zone, for example. So we're looking to exercise our power and influence, but only within our particular region, and not seeking to compete with other powers in the world outside of that geographical boundaries defined by the two oceans. So if that were to be the case, we could imagine that there is a set of appropriate capabilities and policies that would create a national military strategy that supports that. So we then have these four distinct states of nature. We can imagine what the roles might be, and then what the appropriate national military strategies are. And then our idea is that at any given time in the present, that there is some probability that we would associate with the probability that the future in 10 years would feature the U.S. choosing for A, B, C, or D as a strategic posture. And so we're going to use the idea of 10 years out in order to acknowledge the constraints and the timeframes that are associated with the Department of Defense planning, programming, budgeting, and execution system, which drives the pace of change that the Army has to live with and defines the requirements for the joint force. And so that process of budgeting and decision making also must be responsive to congressional annual budget processes. And so taken collectively, Department of Defense and Congress put into place this kind of system in which the current year that we're in is called the execution year. The next year has an approved budget, submitted by the President, approved by Congress, and which has the force of law. And so we're locked into that spending program, except in the case of dire emergency with legal permissions to change the spending plan. Years 3 through 7 are called the program years, and those feature blueprints for how we would propose to spend the money on programs that we've committed to, as long as nothing in the world changes. And so each year, as we go through time, we're executing one year, and then a year passes, and then the budget year approved by Congress becomes the execution year, and then the first year of the program becomes the budget year. And so we go forward in a series of steps, with each year the executive branch providing a new and updated, modified annual budget for approval to Congress, who then will appropriate money based on their decisions, which then comes to the services, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, for programming and spending. So those 4 to 5 years of the program become blueprints for what will become budgets, and programs of record are developed that give a contracted stream of expected funding for multi-year programs and projects, so that the industrial base can respond in a cost-efficient and timely manner. Beyond the 7 years, we start looking at planning time frames, and so 8 to 10 years might be a short-term time horizon for planning, and that's the one we're going to be concerned with. We're going to use a 10-year target in this model and say, what is the posture of the national strategic objectives 10 years out, so that if once we know what that role is likely to be, we can then craft and plan for and program and budget a development plan that will ensure that we create an army that will be ready and available with the right set of capabilities to meet the needs of that particular scenario. Now, since we're looking 10 years out, we know that there's some probability that any of these postures could be the likely posture. We might say that given the state of the world and projecting trends forward, that there could be, let's say, a 20% chance that we would want to be a hegemon, a 40% chance that we would want to be, that we would end up being a superpower competing for influence with other powers. Maybe, so if that's 20 and 30, maybe a 30% chance that we reduce to a regional power, and maybe a 20% chance that we would be restricted to homeland defense. Those numbers, as long as they total to 100, gives an array or an estimate of the likelihood of any one of these things being the likely state of nature. So our idea then is that as we're monitoring the world today in the year of execution, if we see changes in the world that are significant, they may actually go forward to affect the policymakers who are making decisions on what our posture should be. That those changes in the world today may be significant enough that the probabilities of any of these scenarios coming to pass might change. We can imagine that some things might happen in the world economically where it no longer seems reasonable that we could be a single individual global hegemon. And so maybe that goes from 20 down to 5%. And maybe the possibility of competing a superpower goes up a little bit to maybe 40%. But then the possibility of being regional and homeland defense also increases a little bit. So we can imagine some events today happening that would have consequences 10 years from now that change the probabilities of which state of nature is likely to be the case. If we can do that with some reliability, then we would be rewarded for developing a forecasting system that would allow us to anticipate the probabilities of these different states of nature in order to start buying the programs now that will allow us to have the right set of capabilities for that state of nature. So given that, the next step in our logic model was to say that the amount of dollars that are provided to the Army for the payment of programs are measured in real dollars, and that there are two drivers of change in real dollars that we focused on. The first one was the size of the pie as measured by gross domestic product. And what we said was that if our portion of the president's budget, our percentage that is allocated to the military, remains constant, that one of the ways you get an increase or a decrease in real dollars in the future years is to change the size of the pie. So if the GDP begins to be changed significantly, then that could affect how many dollars come into our budget. The other question to answer then is, if we held the size of the pie constant, we said, what about the percentage of the federal discretionary budget that's allocated to the military? We said that two of the competing choices are discretionary social spending and the money that is being spent to service the considerable national debt. So both of those pressures, policy decisions that might increase the money being allocated to debt service in order to start paying down the debt earlier, could affect the percentage of money available to be spent on military spending. Similarly, a desire by Congress to provide social spending to constituents could put pressure on the discretionary budget and make those dollars reprogrammed away from the military and towards either social spending or debt service. So those were two variables then that we identified that would have an influence on the percentage of the pie that's being allocated to military spending, and in this case to Army spending, and a couple variables that would influence the size of the pie itself. So that's the next step. Having found the drivers, we then say, what are the variables that affect these dependent variables? So these we would think of as dependent variables as being dependent on the values being found in the independent variables. So let's take a look at these four that we've chosen now. Now let me say this about modeling. Are those the right four? Are there only four? Are they equally weighted? Are they the right four? Can they even be measured? Well, what we're doing in this first round of modeling is simply to begin somewhere and then use a study of the model once complete to determine if we think we got those right, or are they simply useful. We can take as a principle that all models are wrong, but some of them are useful. And so we start on this round one of model making simply to get a mark on the walls that we can then adapt and adjust from through other applied research. So we think of debt service as a policy choice made by legislators to start increasing or decreasing the percentage of the budget that's going to be paying down the national debt. Our logic is that if we increase the debt service now, then 10 years from now, the debt may be more under control, and then the pressure on military spending may actually be reduced because the debt has been begun to become managed. So we can see how a choice to increase debt service could actually promote the possibility for an increase in military spending. The next variable is social spending. We saw that as the percentage of money in the budget being spent on health and human services, public education, college programs, Head Starts, family welfare, all of the, if we think of discretionary spending by the government as guns or butter, we think of these as the butter, the provision of social services back to the population, back to the taxpayers, back to the people. That might be measured by looking at the composition of Congress in terms of the political parties and then what their explicit platforms are. We might take a look at the 2016 election of Donald Trump as a rejection of an increase in social spending and a willingness to increase debt service and maybe even to increase the percentage of money going to the military. An election of Hillary Clinton might have made the opposite signal. Or we could look at the composition of the Congress and then the stated positions of those who were successfully elected, and or the Senate. And so by measuring some things that inform the policies on social spending, we might be able to get some anticipation of the likely futures. Technology we thought of as being those innovations that lead to increased production and economic power, and that's one of the bedrocks of the American economy. That could lead to increasing the size of the pie. Technology might also create robots who increase production, but which put people out of work, and so a demand for more education, which might lead to an increase in social spending, which might have a decreasing pressure on the percentage of money available to military budgets. So you can see that some of these variables have contributions in both directions and can influence the answers to the percentage of the pie and the size of the pie. And finally, we thought about climate change as a significant variable because it has been already identified as the most significant threat to the nation, according to one of our chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Whether you agree with them or not, it certainly has the potential for being having a large influence on those budget decisions and on gross domestic product. We could imagine a case in which dramatic global warming might hinder American agriculture and reduce the money that we're earning from food sales overseas. That would cause the pie to shrink. And that might also cause an increase in a demand for social spending to provide price support to farmers who no longer can sell to overseas markets. On the other hand, some trends in climate change might be paired with technology to make us a world leader in providing alternative energy solutions, which could lead to an increase in the size of the pie. So there are some relationships now that have to be explored by what we mean about these variables, and then what the possibility of their influence on those independent variables. So now let's go back a little bit and say, look, we are going to choose a set of indicators that will give us insights into the themes and trends that are emerging from debt service in order to decide how that's going to influence these independent variables. And let us suppose that we have in the world a vast set of possible variables that could be chosen, or a vast set of indicators that might be developed to measure different aspects of the probability of increased debt service based on political decision making. And that there might be a vast number of things that we could measure as indicators of a likely change in policy with respect to the amount of social spending we could expect to see, and with the pressure that that puts on military spending in a competition for limited number of discretionary dollars. And let's suppose that there's a whole world of possible things to measure that measure our relative strength in competing for innovative technologies. And let's suppose there are a wide variety of things to measure that talk about the probability of action being taken on climate change with the corresponding budget pressure, or the possibility that climate change could actually occur with significant economic effects. And so the master's student now has to think about generating a list of possible indicators and then using the Toolman argument model to make a case for why some sample of those indicators are an appropriate and representative set of indicators that could allow us to make decisions about the direction of likely policies on debt service in the future. And the same thing with the probability that social spending would increase or decrease, and that might put pressure on money available in the percentage of the pie that goes to military spending. Or we could measure things that predict our preeminence in the technological innovation, like the number of STEM PhDs being produced each year that are domestic, or the number of patents being filed, or the number of innovative products being brought to market, or performance numbers for computers or transportation systems. And then finally, indicators that not only measure actual climate change and its magnitude, but also the probability that governments will make policy decisions to spend money on responses to climate change and squeeze out money that's available for military funding because it's going towards perhaps social spending. So you can see that it's sort of necessary to find those dependent variables that drive, or the independent variables that drive these drivers, and that identifying possible indicators for each of those variables is necessary, and then some persuasive argument which says why the number and type of indicators we've chosen is representative of what's going on inside that domain. As these things cooking and being dynamic and bubbling along, some things going up, some things going down, what is the argument that says that the number and type of indicators we've chosen are persuasive in estimating future trends emerging from this laboratory? So we would have to make that kind of choice for each of those. Now this approach is a modification of the idea behind Kaplan and Norton's balanced scorecard approach. And in their approach, as applied towards business strategy making, they take the position that there are too many variables in play to develop a comprehensive, complete, and predictive, objective model that could be used to then determine what the best strategy should be mathematically. And so in that kind of a world of complexity, which goes beyond our ability to compute with precision in sociological problems, that the idea is you then select a number of variables that drive model performance or strategic performance, and then select some of those as key variables, and then pick a good sample of indicators from the pool of available indicators to use that to give a grade or to get some predictive value about the variable and how it shapes the future possibilities. And so this is the adaptation of that balanced scorecard then is going to allow us to develop a descriptive model which is explicit. We will be explicit about why we picked these states of nature, how we describe them. We will be explicit about the components of an appropriate national military strategy. We will be explicit about how we assign probabilities to those on the basis of indicators that we are seeing. We'll be explicit about which indicators we've chosen from the available pool and how they contribute to these variables, so that each one of these objects, each one of these components of the model can be subjected to additional research, dialogue, and professional judgment to refine the different components. And then taken together, we have a system that allows us to understand and illuminate the dynamics, the constraints, the limitations, the principles, the stakeholders, their policy choices, their interests and risks can be reflected in the various components of this model. And so this open model then allows us to supervise and refine and creates the basis for a common language about how we think the world works. We might present this model to folks in the business and say, is this how you see it? How would you change the model? Where is it strong? Where is it weak? Where does it need more detail? What are the various numbers that are needed to be able to generate these? What are the weights and measures being used, the influence? Are these variables equally weighted, or is there some variation? Are they dynamic or are they static? What's the right number of indicators to choose? How do we measure them with confidence and reliability? What's the correlation between performance of indicators and future probabilities for states of nature? What are all of those relationships? So this is early in the stages of developing a prescriptive model, and now I want to talk about this as an educational device. So for the master's student, this is a way to help them develop the skills in applying theory, like balanced scorecard, supply chain management, funding. You'll learn about future scenario forecasting, strategic planning, some political science theories, various models that the profession uses to understand policies and national power in the form of the DIME model, for example, diplomacy, information, military, and economic domains. So there's a lot of opportunities to explore pieces of theories, supporting models, to apply creative and critical thinking in the form of the Toolman model, generating possibilities, using maybe something like the De Bono 6 hats in order to identify who the stakeholders are, how they will respond to various changes in the world in each of those variables. And so he gets a chance to do some applied research, or almost like a grounded theory kind of approach, to build a model that helps him and us understand the world as it works. So there's some qualitative applied research involved in this case study. Now, as a pedagogical device, and as an artifact, the work that he does will then become available to us in our professional curriculum to form the basis for readings and discussions and research. He will have given us the bootstrap up. He will have jump-started our ability to talk about these kinds of issues with the students and equip them to start thinking about complex military and economic strategy mixes and their role in the generating force as advisors and capability developers who have to live in a world that's informed by sociology, politics, economics, and uncertainty. And so to help them be ready for operating in that kind of complex, uncertain, chaotic environment, giving them the cognitive scaffolding of these kinds of this kind of a model and the supporting research that goes into it is a nice way to start. Very efficient and effective use of this master's research then to jumpstart curriculum artifacts and to write lesson plans. Now, because this has the qualities of a flow model, it is very possible to turn this into a dynamic model that would allow players to take different positions and represent different stakeholders in the process and have them, through the interplay of their decisions, start modeling this dynamically and use that as a way to illustrate how quickly things can change, or to finding methods of negotiation to build collaborative solutions, or to engage in collaborative learning. So if the faculty turns this into a game, then the game could be a form of experiential learning whereby the playing of the game is a pedagogical device that creates experiences that allow students to engage with physically, visually, auditorily, to engage with complex material and increase the possibility of retention because it gets them into the affective domain. It lets them see the dynamic knowledge in action, and all the literature on experiential learning with games goes in to support why that could be an effective pedagogical device and not just a lecture like I'm doing now. It'd be much better if we just played the game and I stopped talking, and we'll do that as soon as I build it. Well, we can go even a step further now and go back and look at the original possibility. Student game design is a teaching methodology now that we've laid the foundations of this. What we can actually do now is start with this as a cognitive scaffolding and then ask the students how they might turn this into a game. How could you make rules and players and victory conditions, and what kinds of decisions could you model that would make this a game that would be fun to play? And then in the act of thinking about how to turn this into a game, the students would be engaging with the important ideas and the concepts and the trade-offs and identifying players. And this would be both a creative exercise and a critical exercise. And in the process of developing the game, they would learn to think like designers who are looking for creative ways to turn possibilities into innovative realities that have some payoff. In other words, applied creativity, which requires some skills to be creative, to be collaborative, and then ultimately to be critical, to find those ideas that have merit, the ones that have traction, and to turn this into games. So the development of a game that's playable causes them to think about this operation in many different perspectives, to look through different sets of eyes. And this multi-perspective approach creates the opportunities for pedagogy, in that they will be able to connect these big ideas as designers and own the process. And we think, therefore, that would be the argument why this could lead to learning that lasts. And we have some evidence already that when students are active designers of games they want to play, that the game concepts then become more accessible to them in both short-term and long-term memory, and they have a better visualization and understanding of how these complex variables work together in the real world to create sociological conditions and environments, and they get a deeper appreciation of politics and economics outside of their strict military application. So even though this is a game that is designed to try to improve our ability to prioritize military programs, it's also a way to develop insights into those other elements of national power, diplomacy, information, economics, that are a key part of developing relationships and capabilities with our allies in the world, which are the key phase zero tasks that we need to be able to build strong allies in a community of peaceful nations that can resist the calls to violence and instability that are represented by the forces of hybrid states and rogue states in the world. So the theory then that we will test is whether or not we can take this initial modeling offered by the master's student and the background reading, research, and writing that he's done to support with cognitive insights and scaffolding. Can we use this artifact and then use game design by our students to actually improve our pedagogical effectiveness in teaching them these critical cognitive skills? This will teach problem solving, creativity, problem framing, and it could also result in playing a game or designing a game that they then want to play. And then through the playing of the game and then subsequent refinement of the rules, our theory would be is that this will cast light and illumination on the essential dynamic elements of this situation and create long-term habits of minds and perspective that they can then apply in other areas that demand critical and creative thinking. And so that will be an application part of this research. Can we then, in that phase, if phase one were the research work and phase two was the presentation of this information to faculty, and phase three was the development of some pilot programs where students are asked to design games, and then another group of students might be just presented this in the lecture form, and a third group as a game ready to play, but without the design elements, but going beyond those lectures. We now have the possibility of testing the various pedagogical approaches and then examine which seem to be the most effective. And to do that, we would look at performance on standardized tests. We would look at student and faculty feedbacks generated by focus groups. We would take a look at some other programmatic measurements of performance to see what the return on the investment of time is with respect to both the short-term and long-term knowledge base of our students on this complex topic. And so there is at least 4 stages of a potential research project that's available as a consequence of developing this line of reasoning, and that's what we'll be looking at over the course of the year. And so, in conclusion, what I would say is this is a case study method of research in which, within very tight limits, we're trying to do applied professional thinking with the idea of improving our understanding of this complex area within very tight limits. It will use a mixture of both quantitative and qualitative approaches. It will resemble grounded theory in a way in that the officer is trying to develop an operational model for a complex process, and in so doing, generate an explicit model that will support systems thinking and other forms of participatory action research to further develop professional competencies in an officer population. The testing of the game design as pedagogy then will give us insights into how we go about developing curriculum and making choices on how to improve the learning rate for complex material. And because this is complex material and it's a game designed to handle complexity, it may very well be that some of the elements of game design will support the cognitive skill of design thinking, which gets us out of our rational economic utilitarian models and allow us to bring to bear insights from the creative dimensions of our brains, the innovative dimensions. So we'll be looking for a number of these kinds of payoffs. So that's everything I wanted to cover on this, and I'm certainly appreciative of your kind attention and look forward to engaging with you on this project in whatever capacity you're interested in. So thanks for hanging in there, and look forward to future discussions with you. Take good care. This is Dr. Law from Colorado Tech and the Command and General Staff College signing off.